Moving between Manchester and Palmyra, the Smith family would have been familiar with a large hill in that area. The hill was later called the Hill Cumorah. Joseph and his family would have recognized this large hill as a landmark in that part of the country. It was something that could not have been missed. Moroni explained and taught young Joseph about the record hidden in the Hill Cumorah. Preparing Joseph for his responsibilities, Moroni in vision and later in person showed Joseph where on the hill the stone box was located that held the Nephite record. Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and others tell us that more than once Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Smith, and others went into a cavern or room in the Hill Cumorah. There they saw the plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated, as well as the Sword of Laban. They also describe the room being filled and stacked with, quote, many wagon loads of plates, unquote, which may have been the Nephite history from which Mormon abridged into our modern Book of Mormon. This hill was also the repository of the 24 plates, which are 24 volumes of plates containing the Jaredite history. These are the records Moroni abridges after the Nephite destruction, providing the latter-day reader a second witness and a second history of another fallen people upon the same promised land. The Jaredites and the Book of Ether are found in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon has three intrinsic messages written for the latter-day reader. 1. It contains a fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and this is for the whole world. 2. It's a record of a fallen people. This is to warn members of the church, lest they become as the Nephites of old. They were a people who knew and understood the gospel. And 3, it contains what Moroni calls the everlasting decree, or we might call the deed restrictions connected to the promised land. And that's for those who are living on that promised land. As it says in the scripture, whatsoever people shall dwell there shall worship the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ, or be swept off. Moroni knew that this sacred record contained a history of three migrations to the promised land, the Jaredites, the Mulekites, and the Lehites. Yet it is actually written for a fourth migration to that same land, the Gentiles that come out of captivity, who become a mighty nation upon that same land. Moroni, the last Nephite prophet and keeper of the record, is responsible for the safekeeping of the plates. Even as a resurrected being, he still retains that responsibility. Moroni teaches and prepares Joseph Smith to receive and translate these records. Moroni, as the keeper of the record, is responsible to retrieve them from Joseph when needed and aid him in the protection of this sacred record. According to the Book of Mormon, Cumorah was the place of the last battle and last stand of the Nephites. It was here that the genocide and extermination of a nation and people took place. Heber C. Kimball writes about Cumorah in his diary, stating that when growing up in the area of Cumorah and Palmyra, he writes, traveling over and around Cumorah, that there were fortifications around the base of the hill and fortifications on the top of the mountain. Kimball also states that one could find skulls and bones as well as weapons of war, arrow points, and axe heads throughout the area and on the hill itself. Heber C. Kimball also states that while he, working in the fields near Cumorah, that he personally turned over many artifacts of war, as well as iron implements with his plow. Now, in my opinion, and I stress it is my opinion, I believe that the last stand took place here because it was a stand under the direction of Mormon and Moroni to protect and conceal the record repository for future generations. A few years ago, I helped set up a small museum in Palmyra, and when doing so, a number of local farmers were talked to. They had barrels, 55-gallon barrels filled with artifacts and weapons of war. There have archaeologically been found more weapons of war and battle here and around Cumorah than any other archaeological site in the world. From this hill, the Nephite prophets speak from the dust, as this nation sealed their history and record with their blood that covered this ground. The leaders of the Nephite forces, Mormon and Moroni, did all in their power to preserve the record for future generations. When the record was completed, there were no Nephites left to read it. This scriptural history was written for us today. The only group or people that read this sacred text are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Mormon and Moroni knew this, and they wrote, they worked, they abridged, they hid, and they protect the record even unto their own deaths, that we, all members of the church, could have their history, testimony, and words. To ignore their words, to ignore this Book of Mormon, to ignore this history, is to ignore their lives, making their sacrifices mute and meaningless, and making their very deaths in the protection of this scripture a vain endeavor. These great men and prophets did what they did because they love God and they love His work. They gave their lives because they knew that their God would love us also.